He walked into the courtroom expecting justice, but what he faced was something else entirely. A man, confident in his rights, suddenly reduced to silence, not by guilt, but by the weight of prejudice. One warning, one fine, one humiliating moment that carried centuries of history in its shadow. But this wasn't just any man, and the truth about who he really was would turn the entire room upside down. How does a system built on justice fail so easily? And what happens when the wrong person becomes its target? Marcus was no stranger to hard work. Every morning, he rose before the sun, kissed his kids goodbye, and carried the quiet pride of a man who had earned his place in the world. He wasn't famous, he wasn't rich, but he was respected. A dedicated father, a loving husband, and a professional whose life revolved around discipline and integrity. On this particular day, he walked into the courthouse like he always did, calm, prepared, and ready to handle another routine hearing. To him, this was just another step in a career built on truth and justice. The polished floors, the heavy doors, the rows of benches, he'd seen them all 1,000 times before. Nothing about this morning suggested that anything would be different. But under the surface, something was waiting. A single moment, unexpected and sharp, would pierce through the calm of his carefully built life. It wouldn't matter how many years he had studied, how many cases he had won, or how hard he had worked to stand tall in a system he believed in. Because in an instant, Marcus would learn that to some, the color of his skin spoke louder than his title. At first, everything seemed ordinary. Marcus took his seat, reviewing his notes while the courtroom murmured around him. But then, just a shift in tone, a pause too long, a stare that lingered. The judge's eyes swept across the room and landed on Marcus, not as a professional, not as an equal, but as something else entirely. It started subtle, a curt remark when Marcus addressed the bench, a raised eyebrow at his tone, as though confidence itself was out of place on his lips. Then came the words, sharp, dismissive, impossible to ignore. "Watch your tone." The command sliced through the room, silencing even the whispers. Marcus froze, the weight of the moment pressing heavy against his chest. He had spoken respectfully, carefully, as he always did. But suddenly, his words were no longer about law. They were about perception, about power, about a man in a robe deciding that Marcus's voice carried too much weight, too much strength, for someone who looked like him. The fine came next, as quick as it was humiliating. A punishment for nothing more than presence, delivered with the casual cruelty of someone who believed no one would dare question it. The room shifted. Some looked away, others smirked. And Marcus stood alone in a place where he was supposed to belong. Years of study, decades of discipline, erased in an instant by prejudice hiding behind authority. His heart pounded, but his face held steady. To react would only feed their assumptions. To stay silent, though, felt like surrender. Inside, he was torn. Dozens of memories flooded back, small moments of disrespect, quiet slights he had buried, just to keep moving forward. But this was different. This was public. This was power, aimed at breaking him down in front of everyone. And the question pressed harder with every second. What happens if he resists? The hearing dragged on, but the atmosphere had shifted. Every word Marcus spoke carried the weight of danger. Would the judge interrupt again? Would the next reprimand escalate into something worse? His colleagues avoided his gaze, their silence echoing louder than any verdict. Still, Marcus refused to bend. Every statement he made was deliberate, steady, carved out of the storm inside him. If they wanted to see him falter, they would be disappointed. Yet even as he stood his ground, the thought gnawed at him. If this is happening to me, a man who knows the law inside and out, what happens to those who have no defense at all? The moment built, heavy and suffocating, until it was clear this day would not end quietly. Because the truth about Marcus's identity had not yet surfaced, and when it did, it wouldn't just challenge the judge's assumptions, it would shatter the illusion that prejudice could hide behind power without consequence. Something was coming, and no one in that courtroom was prepared for it. The gavel struck like a gunshot, echoing across the courtroom. Marcus stood frozen, his body stiff, his breath shallow, as the judge's words cut deeper than any sentence of law. A fine, public humiliation, sealed with authority. The message was clear. Know your place. For a moment, the world around him blurred. He wasn't just standing in a courtroom anymore. He was standing in every classroom where teachers doubted his abilities, every street where strangers crossed the road at his presence, every office where his voice was dismissed before it was heard. This wasn't one incident. This was centuries of weight pressing down on his shoulders. But then, something shifted. The silence that followed was heavy, expectant, until the truth that could no longer stay hidden, came crashing into the room. Marcus wasn't just another man in the crowd. He wasn't just another defendant, another citizen to be silenced. He was a federal prosecutor, a man who had sworn an oath to uphold the very system now being used against him. Gasps rippled through the benches. The smirks vanished. The judge's expression faltered, the authority in his voice suddenly fragile. And in that instant, the balance of power cracked wide open. The same system that had sought to shame Marcus was now exposed, laid bare for all to see. The tension thickened, impossible to ignore. Would justice finally speak? Or would prejudice tighten its grip, doubling down to protect itself? Marcus's heart thundered as he raised his head, steady, unbroken. For the first time, the judge seemed to realize what had happened, that his words, his actions, had not just targeted a man, but betrayed the very institution he claimed to defend. And in that fragile silence, one truth lingered like a blade, in the air. This wasn't just Marcus's fight anymore. It was everyone's. When the truth came out, the courtroom shifted. The authority that had been used to diminish Marcus now trembled under the weight of exposure. The judge's tone softened. The gavel no longer carried the same power. But for Marcus, the damage had already been done. No fine, no apology, no sudden change in tone could erase what he had just endured. He walked out of that room not as a victim, but as a mirror, reflecting back the reality of a system that still treats skin color as evidence. Before facts, prejudice as law before justice. He had faced humiliation in the very place meant to uphold fairness. And if he, a federal prosecutor, could be silenced, fined, and dismissed because of the color of his skin, what chance did others have? That question lingered heavier than the judge's words. It wasn't about one courtroom or one man. It was about every young boy told to stay quiet, every woman who's doubted before she's heard, every family that carries the fear of what happens when justice is not blind, but biased. Marcus's story is not an isolated moment. It's a reflection of something far bigger, a wound that continues to bleed through generations, and it leaves us with a choice. Do we turn away, pretending not to see? Or do we finally admit the truth staring back at us? Because at the end of the day, this story isn't just about Marcus. It's about all of us. About the world we accept and the world we're willing to fight for. So ask yourself, how many more Marcuses will it take before silence is no longer an option?